We're really excited for the opportunity to discuss today with our panelists the state of our global efforts to address climate change and where we stand after COP26. So my name is Colin Hickey, and that over at the other end of the table is Simona Capasani, and we're going to be co-moderating the event. Simona and I are both postdoctoral research associates in the Meadows Environmental Institute and the University Center for Human Values on the Climate Futures Initiative. And just before we get started, we wanted to extend a hearty thanks to the HMEI, the UCHV, C-PREE, and all the staff involved in making this event happen. So they're sitting around the room. So we really appreciate your efforts. Thank you.
And I just wanted to take a moment to also recognize that we're holding this event on the ancient homeland and traditional territory of the Lenni Lenape people, so whose presence and resilience is continuing to this day. So we wanted to take the chance to affirm their sovereignty, as well as the sovereignty of other indigenous caretakers of these lands and waters, and acknowledge, given some of the things we're going to be discussing today, that climate justice requires us to take the necessary measures to ensure full participation and support the sovereignty and leadership of indigenous people. So just to situate where we're all at, Colin and I are both moral philosophers by training. And so in evaluating where we wanted to go with this kind of event, and in light of COP26, the goal today is to bring into interdisciplinary conversation the scientific, political, and ethical dimensions of climate change. So as a moral problem that ranges across varying time scales and around the globe and at every level of social organization, any hope of figuring out what we ought to do will emerge from the intersection of robust interdisciplinary exchange.
So in light of that, and those facts, at the Climate Futures Initiative, what we wanted to do is provide spaces, basically, to engage across domains of expertise on the many pressing moral challenges of climate change. And so as the dust settles from COP, we wanted a space to raise and collectively deliberate about a bunch of moral questions, things like, right, how should we understand the moral weight of losses and damages that are already accumulating from climate change or that are at this point unavoidable because of failures to mitigate? How can we best balance or realize all of the pluralistic goods and moral values at stake as we approach adaptation efforts? What kind of feasibility constraints do we need to attend to when pursuing our climate targets, right? And how can different kinds of agents push the boundaries of what's possible? And can we articulate sort of visions of the good life with lower resource footprints or that are oriented towards promoting justice? So our hope is that the discussion tonight about where things stand after COP26 can serve as a sort of jumping off point for a rich set of conversations moving forward. And with that, Simona is going to introduce our first panelist.
Yes, we're really fortunate to have Denise Mauzerall with us today, and she'll be offering some remarks going first. So Denise is a professor of environmental engineering and international affairs. Her research examines linkages between air pollution and impacts of human health. And her current work investigates co-benefits of renewable energy transition in China, issues regarding methane linkage, and the effects of climate change on air quality. So she's been a contributing author to the IPCC, has published more than 70 peer-reviewed articles. So we wanted to welcome you, and thanks for being here today.
Thanks. Glad to be here, and thanks for the invitation to speak. I thought I would start with background information so we can understand the context of the situation going into COP. And I'm glad to see some of my students from my Global Environmental Issues class here. They will have seen some slides that look similar to this. But what I wanted to show you here is from 1960 through 2021 projected emissions from major emitters. And what you can see first is that China has taken off, and its emissions surpassed the European Union around 2000, the US around 2006, and are now about twice as large as the US. Here's the US. Our emissions have been flat and been coming down, as have the European Union's, and India's emissions are rising. All the other countries of the world are lumped together in the top bar, the top line, and you can see that collectively the rest of the world is about 40% higher than China alone. You can think about emissions also in terms of per capita emissions, and so here you can see that the US is the major emitter with the largest per capita emissions, and our per capita emissions since about the year 2000 have been dropping substantially. If you look at China, you can see that their per capita emissions have surpassed the world levels about 2005 and surpassed the European Union about 2015, and are now just about the same or a little bit below those of Japan. India is rising, but is still less than half of the world average. And then if you look at these emissions by energy source, you can see that the world is still heavily dependent on fossil fuel. This is annual global energy consumption in exajoules. You can see that oil has risen consistently, powering mostly the transport sector, and dropped dramatically during the COVID epidemic. Coal has risen very quickly, driven partly and largely by China starting around 2000, and has begun to come down, and gas is continuing upwards. In contrast, though, to these major sources of energy, if you look down at the bottom of the figure, you can see that the renewables have only begun to rise in the last decade or so. And you can see here at the very bottom is solar and wind. I'm sorry, I'm looking at my computer, which isn't connected to this screen. Okay, so there you can see what I mentioned before, oil, coal, and gas at the top. And then you can see solar and wind and nuclear here down at the bottom. So the world has a really major challenge to convert our use of fossil fuels to non-fossil energy over the next 30, 40, 50 years. We really must make major progress in this decade if we're going to have any hope of maintaining the global temperature below an increase of 1.5 degrees Celsius relative to pre-industrial concentrations. And so my last slide here shows the remaining carbon budget. And so what you see here is in dark purple what has been burned and emitted already. So about 2,500 gigatons of carbon dioxide. And if we're going to have the world stay below 1.5 degrees Celsius, we only have about 420 gigatons left. But recognize that what you saw here, that most of the world is still relying on fossil fuels for its energy supply. And so this is an enormous challenge. Here's 1.7 degrees, we can emit about 770 more. And at 2 degrees, we still have only about a third remaining in what the atmosphere can take up before we have a 50% likelihood of exceeding a 2-degree increase in global average temperature. So this is a very sobering situation that we're facing going into COP26. And the question we were asked to address is success or failure. So I would say in some ways it's a success. The world's taking climate change far more seriously than ever before. The urgency to transform our energy economy is being really widely recognized, and discussions of how to reduce emissions from the agricultural and forest sectors is getting more prominence in the international conversations. There's, I think, an explicit worldwide recognition we have to move away from fossil fuels, and that was part of what came out of COP26. But the plan that was forwarded to try and phase out coal was really weakened at the last minute by India, who had only agreed to a phase down. India did commit to a net carbon neutrality goal of 2070, net zero emissions by 2070, joining China's net zero commitment by 2060 and the US and European commitment by 2050. But the trajectories are all going up in terms of emissions, and we have to go down dramatically, extremely rapidly, in order to have any hope of net zero by the mid-century. And so the question is really what's going to happen in this next decade. The countries who are at COP26 were asked to come back next year for COP27 with more ambitious targets to curb emissions. To meet that 1.5 degree target, at least 90% of the remaining coal reserves and 60% of oil and gas reserves have to stay underground. So that's a big difference from what people thought before, that we were going to run out of oil, that we could, we needed to change because of a lack of supply. That's not the case. The world will be able to continue to burn fossil fuels. The supply is there, but we cannot do it without changing our planet to such a degree that it will not be life as we are familiar with it. I can go on for a few, I wasn't tracking the time, but I can say.
Maybe take another minute or so.
Another minute, okay. So I think another positive step is that about 450 financial institutions overseeing about $130 trillion in assets promised to align their portfolios with the goal of achieving net zero emissions by 2050. It's actually not clear really what that means yet. But undoubtedly, financial institutions will have a really important role to play in supporting non-fossil energy options and removing financing from fossil fuels. So by 2030, emissions have to fall by about 40 to 50% if we're going to have a chance of meeting 1.5 degrees. In fact, they're expected to rise by about 15% over the next 10 years. And so this return next year to further, with further commitments in hand from countries around the world will be really critical. And even with the emission commitments that countries have made so far, and a really critical question is, are they going to follow through on their pledges? It's really critical to avoid catastrophic climate change, but you can see the challenges are large, and whether they do or not is really something that we are not sure of yet. And if they don't, it's not just anthropogenic emissions that are going to drive climate change. It's increasing feedbacks with the natural system, where if you thaw the tundra, you get methane emissions. If your temperature goes up and you have more droughts, you have more fires, and you convert your biomass into CO2. We could find ourselves losing control of the climate system if we don't succeed in meeting these targets. I'll have more to say later, but I think I'll stop there.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. And we're looking forward to kind of getting some of that into discussion in a little bit. So it's my pleasure to move on to introduce our next speaker. So we're really fortunate to have Steve Pacala with us today. Steve is at Frederick, the teacher professor in ecology and evolutionary biology. In September, he was appointed to President Biden's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology. And Steve has chaired 3 expert committees for the National Academy of Sciences and received numerous awards and honors for his work. We are fortunate to have you join us today, Steve.
Hi, everybody. So I'm going to be it's a familiar role for me as the voice of optimism. I actually think that COP26 was a success, but the reason I think it was a success is primarily that I don't think these international negotiations are the primary drivers of progress on the carbon and climate problem. But that the non-binding and voluntary process that nations have historically adopted, and certainly that was in evidence in COP26, do facilitate the primary drivers. And I actually think that's their service and goal. So I want to explain why I think that. So if they aren't the primary drivers, if COP26 international negotiations aren't the primary drivers, what is the primary driver? And I think that it's almost unassailable that the single most important factor on progress on the carbon and climate problem has been technological innovation and revolution. The cost of solar declines in halves every 3 years. That means if you go 6 years ago, it was 4x. Now you try to sell the transition to solar when it's 4 times more expensive than fossil alternatives, and it's a difficult sell in the richest and most sort of ethically motivated country in the world, and it's a non-starter in any developing country. And so why have we had that innovation? And the answer is de facto cooperation. It wasn't really cooperation, but what happened is that a whole bunch of nations subsidized renewables, created markets for renewables, and then the firms competed for those subsidized markets and drove the cost down relentlessly over a half century. Sometimes the US was the dominant supplier of subsidies. Sometimes it was Europe. Sometimes it was China. It was like a tag team. If you were an alien and you looked at this from space, you would have thought that we were cooperating in some way, right? And drove the costs down of wind and solar, so they're the cheapest form of electricity on the margin. Same thing happened with lithium-ion batteries and transport. And that means that industrialized countries that already have an installed base of throttleable, firm power sources, most of which that emit, are able to get rid of 80% roughly of their emissions at what looks like scratch or negative cost, all right? because you've already got this installed capacity of the firm sources to back up renewables. And that also then leads to those nations domestically, one or both sides of the political spectrum, seeing no cost in taking action and seeing some benefit. They then, and this is why we see, I think, the United States contemplating passing Build Back Better and having already passed an infrastructure bill. And it's why you see China adopting a net zero target, and even India. These are BRIC countries that aspire to and on their way to becoming developed nations. I also think that deployment leads to further virtuous cycles of cost reductions, which will ultimately bring more and more technologies under the tent that's deployable. And I really hope some of them are like electrolysis from renewable sources that allow developing nations to produce firm power on renewables and kind of go all the way, right? Secondarily, I think that a second driver has been that climate science has continued to beat the drum. And the world's crazy weather came out of the noise and scared everybody. It's obvious to anyone, even a denier, that the weather is weird, all right? And that the average person in the United States thinks climate change is now harming them personally right now. And that also helps to build political momentum. So under conditions like these, when the primary driver is domestic politics, the purpose of a non-binding and voluntary international negotiation is, I think, several-fold. The first is, I think others will talk about it, it brings publicity to the issue internationally and helps your constituents to sort of go along with what you're going to want to do domestically anyway. I think it helps establish international norms and set norms so that you can sort of stay in sync. And in COP26, we got the establishment, sort of the codification of 1.5 degrees as a norm. The NDCs still total 2.4 degrees from the nations of the world, but if you add the companies, Robert Stavins, I noticed, recently calculated that the commitments total 1.7, so there's movement in the right direction here. We had an agreement of words to phase down coal and to phase down inefficient fossil subsidies, and all of these are international norms that are created and codified and regularized at an international negotiation like this. A second purpose is to establish international accounting rules for quantities that are traded during the transition. And here COP26 also delivered because it codified trading rules that kept nations from double counting, for instance, offsets and that sort of thing. So there's a great delivery there. And it's also, an international negotiation like this is the right place for a convening ground of sort of big side deals. And we saw two of these at COP26. The 30% methane reduction pledge from 100 nations, not part of the whole group, but it's a big body. And the second one, to eliminate deforestation, again by 100 nations, including Brazil, and with about a $20 billion in financing, which is, a start. And so these are still voluntary mechanisms. There's no compliance. But these side deals will come back into the next rounds and become norms, international norms, I think. All right? So COP26 did all of these things. What didn't it do? Well, it's often said that these international meetings give voice to the powerless, and they do. But the fact is that there's no action on those voices, all right? And I'm afraid that however defensible from ethical grounds, that we're never going to get a really large transfer of money from developing to developed nations. And you saw this at COP, right, where the damage payments was put off to another meeting. And I've got one other one in my notes here, but it doesn't matter. The doubling of the $100 billion in finance, right? And so there was talk about it, but the point is, who actually pays those monies in the end? What's the biggest disappointment? I would like it if somehow the international community could take acknowledgement and take ownership of the idea that it is the developed nations of the world that have to buy down the cost of technologies for the developing nations. That's something they can do. That's something that's in their self-interest to do. And perhaps we could get the nations of the developed world to invest more in RD&D than was in their own narrow self-interest.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Steve. Let me introduce our now third panelist. Just to remind you really quickly, so Karen Florini, Vice President of Programs at Climate Central, where she works on developing and implementing climate communication strategies.
I'm really glad to be here. I'm glad we're finally getting the technology to work. I have a very different role from the other panelists. I was asked to give you a sense of what it's like to be at the COP as a non-governmental organization. And so I'm calling this Michael's excellent advice. The Michael in question is Michael Oppenheimer of this very panel. Michael and I have known each other for quite a few years at this point, and I hold him in the highest of esteem. So when I needed advice on how best to spend Climate Central's time at the COP, I called him up because he's a veteran COP goer. Until this year, the only COPs I had been to were in my role as a State Department official, which meant I didn't have to think about logistics, and I didn't really have to think very separately about purposes because they were self-evident by the time we got to the COP. So Michael's excellent advice was to be really intentional about what we wanted to accomplish, so we didn't just wander around being overwhelmed, which is easy to do at a COP. So we already knew that our main purpose was to present our new sea level images to as many relevant audiences as we could. But thanks to Michael's prompting, we defined three specific objectives to promote the full range of our free climate communications tools, to connect and reconnect with allies and potential allies in government and media and NGOs, et cetera. And really, especially that was important in the wake of 2 years of COVID, things, of events not going on in COVID that would normally help facilitate informal interactions. So as we thought about our purposes, we kept in mind that COPs are, in fact, as Steve has said, morphing way beyond their initial purposes as a conference of parties to a particular international agreement. So I agree with Steve that COPs are catalysts, not just the negotiations, but the announcements, the public announcements and private announcements and joint public-private announcements, public mobilization and media attention, and as well as the negotiations. If COPs didn't now exist, we would need to invent them because this kind of catalyzing happening on a regular basis is in fact crucial to driving the momentum that we need on climate. So I'll very briefly mention a little bit about the anatomy of a COP. Things go on in a bunch of different locations, not just the official blue zone. We had 40,000 registered delegates from national governments and other organizations. More on that in a moment. Then there's a public green zone exhibition space. Normally that's quite open to the public, but there were COVID restrictions on it this year. There's an innovation zone that is corporate, that is essentially pay to play. And there's a bunch of offsite events like the New York Times Hub would have. It's also somewhat pay to play. There was a modest admission, well, not all that modest, but reasonable admission fee. So one challenge in actually being an NGO at the COP is figuring out what's going on where, when, because there doesn't really seem to be, and in fact, there pretty clearly isn't any kind of a master calendar, at least not that I ever found. So here's what it looks like from above: the blue zone, which I have cleverly outlined in blue, and the green zone in green. So these, and then the innovation zone was another few blocks away. So you also had to come in here and walk through security, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This whole thing is about a little bit more than a half a mile long. So one of the things you most need at a COP is a pair of really, really comfortable walking shoes. You spend a lot of time on your feet. There were a bunch of different sections, this big round space with the floating globe, which had stand-up media stations and presentation areas, and blessedly a few places to actually sit down. The main spine has this much the look and feel of an airport concourse, but the biggest section by volume of the blue zone is the pavilion section. There were nearly 100 different pavilions. They're sponsored by governments, by intergovernmental organizations like the World Meteorological Association and the IPCC, and NGOs. Typically, even governments are doing this in combination and coalition because it costs well upwards of $100,000 to sponsor a pavilion. Pavilions provided photo op stations like this one by the island nation of Tuvalu. And there are seminars and panel presentations. These are called side events in UN speak. And there were receptions, lots of them, where people did not observe much at all in the way of, sorry, we just started having feedback again. Not a lot of social distancing and people taking off masks, et cetera. It's really a miracle to me that this didn't end up being a big super spreader event. So now I'll quickly mention what Climate Central actually did at the COP. For those who don't know us, we're a non-advocacy climate science research and communications group. We never take positions on technologies or policies, but we help publicize particularly the technologies as well as climate impacts. And our 40-person organization, and we're getting bad feedback again. I don't know what's going on here. I'm not changing anything. So our 40-person organization made a big investment. We sent 5 people, including myself and our CEO, Ben Strauss, who earned his PhD at this very august institution that I am addressing despite the feedback. And as I mentioned, why we went to promote our tools, connect with allies, and inform US media audiences. We do a lot of work with the media in the US and internationally. So here's what we did specifically. We worked to share mostly our materials on sea level rise, which we did through multiple side events, an invited display at the Innovation Zone, so we didn't have to pay for it, which was great. Electronic version at the US government's pavilion. For example, at the side event that we co-presented with Chatham House. We really have a feedback gremlin with us today. We shared Picturing Our Future. It's a set of more than 1,000 photorealistic science-based images that show the long-term sea level consequences of various amounts of warming. Because COP26 was in the UK, we started with images from Buckingham Palace. Here's today, after 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees, 3, and 4. We also showed companion maps that let you directly compare what gets wet at 1.5 versus 3 degrees. This is interactive, so you can go down to 1 and up to 4. This is the satellite view. The regular view is, of course, a different set of colors. Our presentation also included our images from the world's tallest building in Dubai, which gets wet feet under our current pathway, or not if we sharply curtail emissions. By the way, Picturing Our Future wouldn't have happened at the 1,000 image scale that it did without the work of 24 members of the entering class at Princeton in September. They did a lot of the heavy lifting in creating these images as part of their community service track during orientation. So thank you, Tigers. One thing that turned out to be quite useful, we actually made an old-fashioned printed booklet of about 12 image pairs. The booklets turned out to be super popular and a great way to engage with people in the moment of individually meeting with them, bumping into them informally. And indeed, that was especially useful in terms of connecting and reconnecting, which was one of our purposes. My favorite example of that is from when I went to try to reconnect with some of my colleagues who'd gone back into the government. There's this rather soulless set of corridors with had the official offices of the government delegations. So I went to the US office to meet, to try to connect with one of my colleagues, was able to do so, showed him the brochure. He got really into it and he really liked it a lot. And as we were chatting, Secretary Kerry, who is now the Special Presidential Envoy on Climate, came down the hall, and my former colleague enthusiastically showed him the brochure as well. So getting it directly to the Special Envoy is the sort of serendipity that the COP allows that not a lot of other circumstances necessarily do. In light of all the technical difficulties, I think I'm going to skip what I was going to say here about a different presentation where we showed some of our other tools, including from our Climate Matters program. I'll just very briefly note that that's a program where we Every week we're sharing information and typically localized analytics with our media partners, about 2,000 meteorologists and reporters around the US. Most of those are localized to the individual media market. We also cover global topics like what's going on in the cryosphere being the parts of the world that all perennially have frozen water, the polar ice caps and glaciers. And anyway, this is just a cute visualization to convey the scale of when the Larsen C iceberg broke off. It's a great ball of ice. And then our third and final purpose was to help our media partners cover the COP, including the ones who weren't themselves there, as well as some who were. To do that, to do that, the week before the COP, we ran localized CMIP6 projections on low and high emission scenarios, localized 2 individual media markets so that media could show their audiences in those locations the implications of what the decisions being made at the COP could be. My colleague Bernadette Woods-Plackey did much of the heavy lifting on this. She's a former broadcast meteorologist who is really in her element on the air, such as at in a special session with the Weather Channel. By the way, remember my earlier mention about trying to promote overall media coverage, and that is an important purpose of the COP. Well, these are time trends since 2000, and you'll see 2021 was way up both in terms of US newspaper coverage and in terms of TV coverage. And I'm going to halt it there.
Michael, thank you for bearing with us and your patience while we try to deal with all this technology stuff. So it's my pleasure to now introduce our fourth and final panelists. So Michael Oppenheimer. Michael is the Albert G. Milbank Professor of Geosciences and International Affairs at SPIA, and he's also the director of the Center for Policy Research on Energy and the Environment. In addition to hundreds of academic publications, Michael's a longtime participant in the IPCC, and including as a review editor for AR6. And Michael, we really look forward to hearing what you have to say. So thanks so much.
So thanks to Steve, I don't have to work very hard here, except that I disagree with his conclusions, but that his positioning forces me to sharpen my position. So thank you, Steve. And to Karen, thank you for that super generous introduction. I think I'm just going to quit and open a consulting firm at this point. Now, let me go over the kind of checklist that Steve created for what's the purpose of these meetings and give my own grades on COP26. First of all, I think the whole point of trying to evaluate whether it was a success or not is wrong. I don't think we should actually be doing that, because COP26 wasn't going to be one of these big flashy episodes like Paris, no matter what level of expectation people tried to construct. The bar was raised much too high. And in fact, it was just one bit of a very long history, which goes back 30 years and will continue until the climate problem is wrestled, not to the ground, but at least comes under some level of control. As far as the specific objectives that Steve outlined, the key thing that everybody looks for with these meetings is an increase in ambition. Let's have some deeper commitments to emissions reduction. In fact, that wasn't possible at this point. These countries have come back essentially in a very short time ago from Paris, where they've made their initial projections. So the point is, the countries of the world, a short 6 years ago, agreed to do something substantial in an unenforced way. And then just very recently, some of these countries, notably the United States, strengthened their nationally determined contributions. And then, after doing that, they go home and they have to figure out how they're going to enforce those commitments. How they're going to, implement those commitments. How are they going to make sure they actually happen? And there's a limit to how far they're going to get ahead of the political reality at home. And coming to meetings every week with everybody expecting that they're going to make commitments that are even stronger than what they made before is foolhardy. It just wasn't going to happen. And it especially wasn't going to happen in the context of this particular meeting, where countries many of them are just haven't yet figured out exactly what they're going to do to implement what they promised to do 6 years ago. So on the main thing that these meetings focus on, which is ambition, if that's your level of a measure of success, it just simply wasn't going to get raised any further. One can argue that the purpose of international negotiations is to specifically reach ambition sufficiently enough to solve the problem at hand and to reduce anxiety about free riding. But we're sort of on the way with that. We weren't at a point where we were going to get and do any better at it. Then there are some of the issues which Steve also mentioned, which are very important to making sure that there's a reality to whatever commitments are made, like the accounting related issues called transparency in this context. My view on what happened at transparency is that we got an ambiguous result. There were certain improvements agreed to in terms of how emissions would be reported. But if you go behind that and you ask individuals from the delegations in different countries how they feel about the outcome, I got ambivalent responses when I did a little testing around. And although I don't have a statistically representative example, the countries I found that were happy about the outcome are exactly the ones that I'd expect to be happy about a remaining substantial lack of transparency. And because I went into this meeting looking at the transparency agreement as the key to whether it really was making any progress, I'm disappointed. Then there are the issues of finance, and I'm going to include with that emissions trading. And there was some significant progress made on the issue of a global trading system, although it's still in relatively primitive form. But on finance, particularly transfer of resources to developing countries, they kicked the can down the road. There was nothing substantial agreed to as far as I can see. On the issue of loss and damage, you can say the same thing. The language just kicks the can down the road. So overall, the meeting had one glaring success. That is its catalytic function, as has been referred to here, or the spotlight, with which it did very well, all out of proportion to anything that was done at the meeting. So I guess that's a good thing. But in terms of moving the ball forward ahead, it's just one more cog in the wheel. It wasn't a big breakthrough. And if we'd all gone into it understanding it was not going to be a big breakthrough, I think many people who are not too happy now would be justifiably a lot happier. So again, the key thing going into any of these meetings is to ask, what's the domestic political frame in the key countries that actually need to agree to something to bring emissions down, and does that framing in each country allow for significant progress to be made at this point? Now I'll close with two items on which my feelings are more ambivalent. And that is they sort of, my bottom line they contradict each other. And there's some good news and some bad. On the bad news front, when one looks at all the signals we're starting to see in the climate system, and one considers how good or how effective or ineffective the US and other countries have been at dealing with the current climate, I would say that we have a very big problem with regard to climate adaptation, which the US government in particular is only starting to grapple with, and which governments in the countries that are going to be harmed the most by climate change, those with the least resources to deal with it, or that are in the already hotter parts of the world, the lack of action on the finance end hurts them particularly on adaptation. And all of us face a rather grim future if we can't get our act together as quickly as possible on that part of the problem. It needs to be promoted to being considered as equally important to the emissions mitigation side. There was one piece of hope. It occurred outside the meeting. And it does reveal that there has been a shift by some countries. In this case, I'm going to refer to the EU and to Europe and to the US. You might recall that the EU has been threatening for many years to implement what are called border tax adjustments or fees on goods in trade and international commerce, which come across into the EU, but come from countries whose mitigation plans are either not as ambitious as the EU's or not being enforced as well as the EU claims it will enforce its plans. And that's supposed to level the playing field. And also, while leveling the trade playing field, also provide an additional incentive for countries to be serious about emissions mitigation. The US played with this idea back in 2009, where legislation that contained the same idea failed in the US. It didn't fail in the Senate. It was never actually brought to the floor, but it passed in the House and then died. But the US apparently is in talks with the EU about forming a small club of nations, an idea which has been floated for many years, to develop a larger than EU system of border tax adjustments. And if that actually is going to happen, and if it's handled with some delicacy, but still some notion of seriousness, it is possible that this could provide the leverage which would bring countries into the business of cutting their emissions faster than they currently intend. And it could become very effective in eventually in bringing other countries into the fold. And as more countries reduce their emissions rapidly and join the tax adjustment club, there's kind of an unstable point or tipping point that's reached. At least that's what theory might tell you. So in the end, I see largely the meeting was business as usual. There were a few notable things that happened at the meeting, like the methane agreement. I personally don't think the forest agreement is worth very much at this point. The progress on emissions trading was important, but basically it was business as usual, which means largely stasis, some incremental progress on some things, some maybe even some step backwards on some others. Thank you.
So thanks to all of you. I think that provides a bunch of important context just for thinking about what a COP is, what it can accomplish, what it can't accomplish, where to be paying attention to at the international level, at the domestic level. And Michael in particular, thanks for bringing up the transparency issue and the adaptation issue. So in the next couple of minutes, I just want to pose one question to the panel, and then we'll open it up to the audience. But, and Steve is in some ways going to get back to you. Hopefully everybody can chat about it, because I wanted to just return to questions about loss and damage and adaptation. And so, of course, one of the important controversies, right, around the current negotiations is about claims of compensation and moral repair, right? So we're moral philosophers. That's why we're coming into this conversation. And so the controversy about compensation and moral repair suffered by the climate vulnerable. So, I mean, one thing that's true is that we're continually improving our attribution science, right? And the more we do that, in principle, the harder it becomes to deny the grounds for advancing claims of compensation, of moral repair. And so I guess I wonder if any of you can speak to the question about sort of how future negotiations, right? So Steve, you were pretty pessimistic about it. There's just like no room for this. But it seems like it's a very important moral cost if we don't pay attention to this. So how can future negotiations give appropriate attention to this kind of relationship between improving attribution science and the kind of claims for compensation? And what kinds of specific forms of redress might need to be included? And then just broader than that, thinking back to some of the points that Michael raised about adaptation, right? So we have some fledgling money from the Biden administration. It's very short of what current needs are for yearly adaptation costs. And those are only going to increase in the next couple of years. So I wonder if any of you can speak on what kind of moral considerations you think are most important to attend to as we start reorienting our thoughts towards adaptation and moving from an approach of kind of post-disaster response to kind of like a risk reduction planning strategy. So whoever wants to take that first, go for it. I sort of directed it at you, Steve, so if you want to go for it.
Let me take this last part of that first. I do think that I I know for a fact that the Biden administration takes the risk reduction strategy seriously and have been handed a task that's directly aimed at that. One of the biggest problems we have in the US is in knowing what the current risks are. The probability density, almost all the damages from climate change happen because of extreme weather. Extreme weather way in the tails of the probability density, meaning the really unlikely ones. And those have changed really rapidly. The attribution science shows this, right? The Pacific Northwest heat wave in this past year that caused such terrible fires was amplified, according to the published papers on this, by at least 2,000-fold from this 1 degree Celsius global change in mean temperature. And so we currently don't know what the risks are. And so if you're trying to plan a risk reduction strategy to manage the tail risk and you don't know what the risks are, it's really hard to do. All right, so there's a level of paralysis that comes from that. And there's also the threat that comes with that paralysis, that uncertainty about the viability of an operation, like for instance, the insurance market in Florida, that would all of a sudden leave mortgages uninsurable, which under the current rules leaves mortgages unattainable, could cause a crash in the financial system anywhere in the world, and that would have then military repercussions, and so it's security implications, and so there's the possibility that a social systems tipping point is much closer than we think, in part because we simply don't know what the extreme weather is, all right? And so the Biden administration takes this really seriously, as well they should. And so one of the first steps to actually having an adequate adaptation strategy is to know what you're adapting to, all right? So on the question of moral harms, I agree with you. I wish I hadn't listened to so many realpolitik colleagues who just don't think that's going to happen. But I do know that where it's likely to happen internationally, where those concerns are going to get heard, is in courts and in governments. That's what I can tell you right now. That's what some of the oil execs I know are worried about. Right? What they're worried about is that somebody's going to say, we've got all kinds of damages. Somebody needs to pay for this. These characters made a whole lot of money. I'm going to take their money. All right? That could be done inside a government with a windfall tax. It could also be done in a court system. And it is being done. I mean, there are thousands of lawsuits worldwide about this. Not many successful yet, but, that's changing.
Does anybody else want to jump in?
I just have
Yeah.
one sentence to say in response to the issue of adaptation, which is that we can't adapt our way out of this problem. We must mitigate. If we don't mitigate, the tails will become more extreme and the means will become more extreme. And so the emphasis in terms of financial resources must go into mitigation, or our situation will become so dire we won't be able to adapt. Full stop.
Thanks. And Michael, you want to jump in?
Any doubt we're never going to adapt our way out of the problem. So it's a given that we have to have substantial emissions reduction. But we've already gotten to the point where emissions reductions are happening too slowly. And when you talk about moral obligations, I think we have a moral obligation to do something substantial to try to protect people. And when it comes to the fact that resources are going to be transferred internationally, well, most of those resources, the developing countries are now, if they had the money, they would use them toward protecting themselves, I think. At least there would be a more equivalence in the attention that's given to emissions reduction policy and adaptation policy. That's enough said on that. Let me say something on the general moral point that was raised in the formulating the question. I think there's some reasonable degree of skepticism about whether how much weight moral concerns carry in this kind of mega problem. But the fact is that ultimately, if the world is going to shift towards a serious and determined effort to solve the problem on either end of the problem, either adaptation or emissions reduction, that's going to take a change in the global norm on how to treat the environment. It's not going to happen through some cold-hearted calculation. And so if you write off the moral argument, you essentially, to me, you write off the long-term prospect of solving the problem. And we do have examples of parts of international problems, at least, that where there has been a notable importance of this kind of moral suasion. So let's not give up on it.
On Zoom, if you can insert your questions into the Q&A function, we will come to them in a second. We're going to take the first couple of questions in the room, but if you start populating there, then Simona will grab them in a second. So are there any questions from people in the room? Yeah. We'll start there.
Hi, I'm Ned Downey. I'm first year PhD in STEP. Thanks a lot for the great talks and the great comments. I was just curious about, Steve, your comment about cost reductions and your expectations of future cost reductions in upcoming key technologies. For the next generation of decarbonization technologies, hydrogen, carbon capture, other types of advanced batteries for long duration, things like that, we've seen some technologies have dropped in this first generation faster than others. PV dropped a lot faster than concentrated solar power. What do we know, or what can we expect about how rates of change might differ among these technologies? What can we learn from what we've seen already about what we might see going forward?
So I'm going to give an answer that's going to sound like a dodge, but it's not. What we've learned is that we must invest in a diverse RD&D portfolio because we can't predict where the cost reductions are going to come fastest. We don't know what the firm source of zero emitting power is going to be that's going to win the marketplace first. And so, fortunately, the US DOE, the appropriations that are in Build Back Better and in the infrastructure bill more than restore the historical investments in energy RD&D that came in the aftermath of the Arab oil embargo and have been dwindling away to a tiny fraction of themselves. And so you will see a massive across-the-board investment supplemented by private capital that acknowledges the emissions reductions that are also embedded in those bills and the forward-looking prospects of market return. So I think we're going to get the diverse portfolio. And if I could predict, I would quit my day job, right? Yeah.
Okay, so I saw a couple of other hands. Yeah.
Hello, I'm Jay. I'm a first-year PhD student at STEP as well. And thank you all very much for your insights into the COP26. And we have been talking about the national actions. And I'm very curious about the role of some national government, especially cities. What are their role in COP26, and how are they influencing the conversations about climate change and climate actions? Thank you.
As you think about answering this, if we also can maybe expand the question to not just cities, but all kinds of different sub-state actors, right? So, so Karen particularly, right, in nonprofit space, media space, individuals, I think that would be helpful to think about these different levels of agency and how they can, all cities up and down, in fact, influence. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to take off my Climate Central hat and put back on my State Department hat a little bit, because one of my roles there was to essentially facilitate and the engagement by the state and city actors. And that gave me an interesting perspective after the end of the Obama administration, when, of course, we had a federal government that was, shall we say, coming from a different place. And right after, the day after Trump announced that he was going to withdraw the US from the Paris Agreement, you had the announcement of "We Are Still In" by a cohort of cities and states and businesses, and essentially saying, look, the US federally may be dropping out, but their literal name was "We Are Still In." And we've actually, with the change to the Biden administration, that's now been changed to "America is still in." And I think that's a really important observation, that even if individual national governments, especially in non-autocratic locations, ratchet back, that they may still find significant portions of their economy and their population driving forward.
Great, so I'm going to read a question that's from Kian Min Swu, so former CFI member here at Princeton. And so this is a question for all the panelists, so we can open that up to everybody. Kian asks, I've heard interesting mixes of views on the US-China agreement. On the one hand, it doesn't come with any specific changes in targets. On the other hand, it could be a basis for future agreements. Whoop. And the rest of the question just disappeared. Hold on one more. Okay, I found it again. And shows that the countries are on the same page. So should we read this as a glass half full or a glass half empty?
These probably make sense for maybe use.
Right, so I've worked in China for a while, and given the political tensions between the US and China right now, I see this as a glass half full, for sure. I think that a pledge to share policy and technology development, potentially have new national targets by 2035, revive a multilateral working group on climate change, all of those are really positive developments. The Chinese are now committing to this 30% methane emission reduction by 2030. China is probably the largest emitter of methane in the world, based on satellite data. I think all of this is really good. Unfortunately, it's not that specific in terms of details of exactly what will be done. So one has to wait and see what actually transpires. But China and the US together are the two largest emitters in the world, accounting for 40% of global emissions. And given the conflicts that are existing right now, I see this as a very positive thing.
And Michael, I wonder if you can chime in too, because I know before COP you said something about how if China would make some progress on the transparency issue, you think that would be the single most important step. So I wonder if you also have thoughts about the bilat or these issues.
Well, I think Denise is absolutely right in the way she stated it. I couldn't state it any better. But since you asked about transparency, what I've heard, and it may be a biased view, is that the Chinese weren't awfully helpful in those discussions. So, but again, I heard several different views of that part of the negotiation. So I take each of them with a grain of salt. Together, they add up to ambiguity about what the outcome was, as far as I'm concerned.
I'm just going to insert myself maybe as a question. Oh,
no, I gotta do my thing.
Yeah, no, just for some things that I had seen populated, but we were talking about risk reduction, and so one question I sort of had, so there seems to be a gap both domestically in terms of maybe full knowledge to be able to sort of predict and deal with sort of the ramifications of extreme weather events. There also is a sort of parallel gap when it comes to the global south, so a certain kind of lack of information that might be flowing through in terms of any kind of predictive modeling about sort of geographical areas being impacted with extreme weather events. So I was wondering to what extent this, or maybe Steve, you had this answer, or Michael, that to what extent this knowledge gap or an epistemic gap when it comes to the modeling on extreme weather events is going to either hinder or maybe improve on making certain kinds of calculations about what to do, particularly in cases of displacement.
I'm just starting to investigate this in a serious way, and have to now. And the word I get so far, we have great climate scientists here, and I've talked to them here and elsewhere. And there is some optimism that it would be possible with modern computational and data analytic means, if you threw a lot of money at this, and the money is for the hardware. Evidently, there's a belief that models can be improved with power, and you can get into the tails. You need to run the models many, many, many times. If you want to get a 1 in 10,000 year event, you better be prepared to run your model 10,000 times, right? For example, right? And so it's expensive to do this. But the good news is that the methodologies for doing this now systematically involve global calculations. And so you would get an answer everywhere. Now, that answer would be better in some places than others, but it would be a global answer. And those places would be better or worse for scientific, not political reasons. Now, translating the extreme weather into damages is an art of the local, right? So that depends on a lot of stuff. And so you're not done yet, but at least there is, the science mandates international action here, internationally useful action here.
Do we want to do another one?
I think Michael's jumping in.
Yeah, so I think the attitude we should take on this is that we've been here before in a certain sense. One of the more interesting statistics is in this business is that the death rates internationally due to tropical cyclones have decreased markedly, while the property damages increased massively, partly violating exposure along the coast. And the reason is widely believed to be because our ability to do weather prediction has improved massively over the 50 years or so that we have any kind of reasonable data about deaths as tropical cyclones. So, I think we should take more or less the same view on the longer term climate problem as we do on the short term weather problem. That is, we're going to be making improvements. We sort of do the best we can with what we have at any state of knowledge, even though we know it's very uncertain. And in some ways, the uncertainty about hurricane pathways was a lot more, was more uncertain in the 1930s, say, than the knowledge now is about the likelihood of certain climate events. So it's a terrain that we're used to making decisions on. I wouldn't want us to get frozen about it. Another way to look at it is you could take the engineering view, which is just give me your best guess and I'll build a wall that high and you'll be protected. Now, that's not a cheap way to do it. And we have a lot of adaptation to do, and it will sometimes fail. But it's a field of operation we're quite used to. So while we're refining the risk calculations, we shouldn't just be standing there scratching our heads about what we do in the meantime.
Melissa.
Thank you all. I wanted to just ask, especially Denise, thank you. I wanted to ask Denise and Steve to say a bit more about this tension between adaptation and mitigation, because it really feels like you could see a future, let's say in the US, where political energy starts to really flow into adaptation, but then that leaves us in the kind of predicament that Denise was saying, where in the meantime, it's going to, in a decade later, just become impossible to adapt. So there's this kind of, and yet it seems like when you raise people's awareness, the first thing that people are becoming more aware of when they feel they're more vulnerable, they're being affected now, their thoughts kind of naturally turn towards adaptation, and the political system is set up to kind of channel them in that way. So I just wondered if any of you, could reflect further on how politically that relationship can be navigated.
I was not implying that there should be no adaptation. So for example, you could imagine that there could be changes in insurance practices. So coastal properties that flooded would, and this is starting already, find it harder and harder to get insurance, which would encourage retreat, because if you can't insure your property and there's a hurricane and it's gone, right? opportunities when you're designing roads or bridges or anything else to take into account the likelihood that the rivers are going to be higher, that there's going to be thawing permafrost, which is going to cause unstable foundations for your roads, and you need to take that into account as you build. But my point was just that the thought that you can continuously adapt and solve the problem through adaptation is misplaced. And I wasn't thinking just about the US, I was thinking about the less developed countries who are tragically going to be devastated by climate change through no fault of their own at all. But their requests, their urgency of needing funds to adapt, I think in the long run, if the world chose to fund the adaptation, they would find that they were worse off in 50 years than they would be if the emphasis was on mitigation now. In 50 years, that would help them more than funds, large funds. I'm not saying that there shouldn't be any funds. There must be something to facilitate some level of adaptation, but large funds going to adaptation will, 50 or 100 years from now, not serve them as well as those funds going to figure out how to really transform the energy system, the agricultural system, preserve the forests, et cetera.
I think John Holdren was President Obama's science advisor, and he always talked about the inevitable trinity of mitigation, adaptation, and suffering. And the less you do with the first two, the more you're going to do with the third. And that's all there is to it, right? And so you need both mitigation and adaptation. I mean, no one's going to argue with that, right? So where does this idea come from that adaptation represents some sort of a moral hazard, right? Well, it comes from the fact that there's been some politicization of these two issues. Dems have favored mitigation, and Republicans say, well, I don't really believe in climate change, but if I did, I'd want to do adaptation, right? And so the point is that we haven't done very much mitigation in this country, and if Build Back Better in its current form passes, then we're on track to do quite a bit. And I absolutely agree with Michael that we're underinvesting in adaptation right now. And it's just that if you'd started investing like crazy in adaptation before you'd taken a serious pass at the mitigation problem, that would be succumbing to a different kind, I think, of moral hazard.
Just I'll point out, and we'll take another question in the room, but another thing to attend to is in that sort of trinity of adaptation, mitigation, and suffering, the distribution of where that suffering rests is very important to attend to with respect to making other decisions about where to invest in, what to avoid investing in, et cetera. So we've got like 5 more minutes or so maybe we can get through, if they're brief, maybe 2 more questions. So let's go up there.
Hi, thanks for the wonderful discussions today. I'm Rohit, the third year STEP PhD student. The overall consensus seems to be that the COP26 is gonna be, if I can use Professor Oppenheimer's word, a cog in the wheel in a long history, one event in the long history of the climate change problem. My question is that apart from technological breakthrough, do you see any other event which can sort of accelerate this whole transition, or this is going to be the trajectory which we should expect in the future?
I personally believe that I mean, I know the U.S. better than most countries, and I believe that there is no question about it that the shift in American public opinion is a necessary condition for us to have significant mitigation and adaptation. And I believe that a lot of that is generational, all right? And so young people need to vote, all right? And they don't. And so if any of you know any young people, tell them to vote. And I suspect that's true in other countries as well. I mean, if I look, one of the interesting things about international polls is that climate change is the leading international concern among the young worldwide, polls #1 as an issue. worldwide. So yeah, time and demography, I hope, will prevail.
I don't know if that's an optimistic note or not. If there's somebody else that has a question, we can try and, squeeze one last one in.
Hi, I'm a PhD student in the chemistry department, and was wondering, we've talked about the need for technological innovation, especially with respect to energy, but for those to have significant emissions impacts, they need to be distributed, not just within the US. And so I was wondering if the panel could comment on prospects for technology transfer, especially given some of the reluctance of the current and previous administration to forego patent enforcement with respect to vaccination technology.
Well, I mean, I do think that the primary way that technology gets distributed is through the economy, right? When you have something that's lowest cost, you actually don't need to push it, right? And so I do think that the reason that wind and solar is growing faster in the developing world than any other form of energy is that it's inexpensive, right? And so I mean, it's kind of a flippant remark, but it's still the case that that innovation sort of solves the distribution problem, right? If it can bring costs down. And to solves is, air quotes here. And, in chemistry right now, every carbon-containing molecule that we have to a very close approximation is produced from petroleum. And in a net zero world, all of those chemicals need to be either produced in such a way that they never enter the atmosphere. And, biodegradability and that sort of, we don't want to fill up our landfills, right? And so we've got to get our carbon molecules somewhere else. Well, we could do C1 chemistry from atmospheric capture, or we could source them from biomass. And we currently lack the ability to produce almost all the chemicals that we use from biomass. And so there's a tremendous growth opportunity, tremendous contribution that chemists can make, and get rich while saving the world. So I think this is a good thing.
Yeah, Michael, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, the most interesting thing that I've seen in the last 20 years in this particular subspace on the climate issue was something that Steve referred to with his remark about if Martians looked down and wondered what was going on down here. They'd think that countries were conspiring with each other to actually do something constructive on the technological change end. And that reminded me that one of the most interesting aspects of that is that Germany implemented a very strong, some people would say went too fast, set of programs to encourage investment in renewable energy. At a time when the price of solar in particular was still rather high, and the Chinese, partly recognizing that there was going to be a market, I think, got in and started deciding that they were going to have a big role in both wind generation and solar photovoltaics and electric vehicles also, and some other aspects of the whole system. And that made for this very nice dynamic by which helped bring the price down. There was a big market and there was a big producer. And if somehow that kind of coordination could happen smoothly, and that's what, international trade is supposed to bring us, et cetera. But it doesn't automate, that was an exception. It doesn't happen very smoothly. And probably there was some forethought, and probably the Martians are right. But exactly what was going on there, I don't know. I've seen one article on it. But I think there needs to be more thinking ahead by countries about how they can collaborate to make good stuff like that happen, where one country's advantage becomes a benefit to another country.
I think that's something that's been missing for a long time and would be really valuable, or for IPCC, if not for COP.
Yeah. So sorry, Michael, I don't know if you heard, but Steve asked if that could be part of COP. Karen, I know you want to jump in. So we're officially getting over time, but I wonder if every panelist can take a final minute to sort of give give some final thoughts, and then we'll close up. So Karen, why don't you go speak on this issue or whatever final thought you want to offer?
Technology enables ambition. Ambition inspires investment. Investment leads to deployment of technology. And then you start the virtuous cycle all over again. The thing that I would add to what Michael said is that there is a significant role which we've actually seen happening, not just at the national government level, but also being stimulated by philanthropic investment through things like the Breakthrough Energy Coalition, as well as for the new methane initiative. They've mobilized $320 million to help jumpstart the work on the methane global methane agreement as well.
Thanks, Michael. Do you want to offer a final thoughts?
Just everybody's had plenty to say. I just want to add that I think that the debate about emissions mitigation versus adaptation, it's been made clear that we can't get out of the problem by doing just one, because mitigation we haven't done enough, we're way behind, or adaptation, we're going to need both, as Steve so articulately said. I think we all agree on that, and the thing to avoid is to let others set the one against the other. And, by having arguments about where the next marginal dollar goes, I think is a mistake, and it's the wrong way to frame it. Bottom line, I think there's still a good chance we're actually going to get out of this problem in a way which will make people 50 years from now think, okay, they tried hard, they didn't quite get as far as they should have, but at least we're still here and doing okay.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Denise or Steve, do you want to?
So I'll just follow on from Michael and say, I think that the world's waking up, that this is a serious problem, and there's huge opportunities to do well by doing good. And I'm also somewhat optimistic now that the world will coalesce around a lot of effort on mitigation and adaptation, and that we will get through this bottleneck century and come out the other end.
So fantastic. Steve, do you want to offer, or you're going to pass? Okay, well, with that, we're a little bit over time, so thank you everybody for bearing with us with the technology. We've learned a lot about climate, and we've learned also that this is not the greatest room for technology. So we're going to have to wrap up here, but thanks for coming, both here and online, and thanks to all the staff again that made this happen, and most importantly, if you will all join me in thanking our panelists for their insights. We look forward to hopefully continuing some of these conversations in future events in the spring. Thanks so much.